In 18,000 BCE, the cold was a killer. It tore hide tents from the ground, buried shelters in snow, and slowly drained the life from anyone caught in its path. For Kalen, a hunter watching his daughter weaken day by day, the wind wasn't just weather. It was an enemy. Then he noticed the mammoth bones scattered across the frozen valley, massive skulls, tusks, and limb bones that the storms couldn't budge. What if these weren't remains of the dead, but the key to protecting the living? Driven by desperation, Kalen rallied his community to attempt something no one had imagined: building a home entirely from bones. They hauled nearly 20 tons of mammoth remains, interlocking femurs for walls and shaping a domed roof from tusks. The result was warm, sturdy, windproof, and soon deadly. Without ventilation, smoke and moisture poisoned the air, threatening to finish what the cold had started. Only by studying nature, a fox den's rising breath, did Kalen discover the solution: a bone chimney that let the wind itself flush the house with clean air. How did this radical experiment become one of prehistory's most ingenious survival breakthroughs? Part 1. The wind was a living thing on the night of September 28, 18,000 BCE. It had a voice that vibrated through the frozen earth and teeth that gnawed at the edges of their hide tent. Kalen, whose face bore the marks of 30 such winters, lay listening to it. Beside him, his mate Lyra stirred, pulling the heavy mammoth furs tighter around their daughter, Ilara. The child's breathing was shallow and rasping. For weeks, a cough had racked her small frame. Their settlement nestled in a bend of the Dnieper River in what would one day be Ukraine. It was a strategic location chosen by the ancestors for its proximity to the river and the mammoth migration routes. But on this night, it felt like a trap. The signs had been there since July 12th. The summer had been unusually short. The herds of reindeer and horse had migrated south on August 3rd, weeks earlier than usual. The mammoths were scarce. The elders had spoken of a deepening of the great cold. Kalen was a hunter, one of the best. But he was also a builder, a man who understood the properties of wood, stone, and hide. He had built their tent with his own hands on June 15th, stretching thick, cured hides over a frame of driftwood. It was a good tent, as good as any in the settlement, but it was not enough. The wind was their enemy, a relentless foe that stole their warmth and strength. Kalen had seen what it could do on the night of August 19th, when it tore 3 tents from their moorings. He had seen it drive snow into drifts so high on September 5th that they buried shelters completely. He rose from his furs on September 29th and added dried mammoth dung to the small fire. He looked at Ilara, her small face pale in the firelight. He felt a surge of helpless anger against the cold, against the wind, against his own inability to protect his child. He stepped outside. The air was so cold it burned his lungs. He walked to the edge of the settlement, his boots crunching on hard-packed snow. He stood on a low rise, his gaze sweeping across the frozen river valley. And then he saw them. They were scattered across the landscape, half buried in the snow. They were the bones of mammoths, the remains of countless generations. The wind howled around them, but the bones did not move. They were solid, immovable, a part of the earth itself. He had seen them 1,000 times before. They were a source of fuel for their fires, material for their tools. But tonight he saw them with new eyes. He saw them not as the remains of the dead, but as the building blocks of the living. He saw the massive skulls, their eye sockets like dark caves. He saw the long, curved tusks, the huge shoulder blades, the thick leg bones. An idea began to form in his mind, an idea so audacious that it took his breath away. What if he could build a house of bones, a house with walls of bone, a roof of hide, a foundation of skulls, a house that would not just resist the wind, but would defy it? It was a mad idea, a dream born of desperation. But as he thought of Alara, he knew it was a gamble he had to take. He returned to the tent, his mind a whirlwind of plans. He sat by the fire, his hands sketching in the ash. He would dig a shallow pit. He would lay a foundation of mammoth skulls. He would build walls of interlocking leg bones and shoulder blades. He would use the long tusks to create a domed roof. He would cover it all with thick hides. By the time dawn crept across the sky on September 30th, he had a plan. He presented his idea to the community on October 1st. They gathered in the largest of the pit houses, their faces grim. They listened as he spoke, his voice filled with conviction. He showed them his sketches, explained his vision. When he finished, there was a long, heavy silence. The elders shook their heads. It was the talk of a madman. "We are hunters, not builders of bone houses," one of the elders, a man named Boar, said on October 2nd, his voice full of scorn. "Our ancestors have lived in hide tents for 1,000 generations. To challenge the wind is to challenge the spirits of the land. It will bring only ruin." Kaelin listened, his heart sinking. He looked at the faces of his people, and he saw fear, doubt, the dead weight of tradition. But then Lyra spoke. She stood before the community on October 3rd, her voice clear and strong. "My daughter is dying," she said, her eyes meeting every gaze. "The wind is killing her. It is killing all of us. Kaelin's plan is a risk, but to do nothing is a greater risk. I will stand with my mate. I will help him build his house of bones." Her words had a powerful effect. A murmur went through the crowd. They looked at their own children. They felt the same fear, the same desperation. One by one, they began to agree. They would help Kaelin. They would take the risk. It was a decision born not of faith, but of desperate hope. And so, on October 4th, they began their work. They were a small, determined band of hunter-gatherers, armed with nothing but their stone tools, their hide ropes, and a radical idea. They were about to challenge the wind, to challenge the winter. Part 2. The work began on October 5th, under a sky the color of lead. The air was already sharp with the promise of the coming deep winter. The first task was the gathering of the bones. It was a monumental undertaking, a harvest of the dead. They worked in teams, fanning out across the river valley. Kaelin directed the effort, his voice sharp and clear above the wind. He had spent the night of October 4th walking the valley, marking the best bones with red ochre. He needed the massive skulls for the foundation, the long femurs and tibias for the walls, the broad scapulae to fill the gaps, and the great tusks for the roof. They used their stone axes to chop the bones free from the frozen earth. They used their hide ropes to drag the massive pieces back to the building site. It was back-breaking work. A single mammoth skull could weigh as much as 2 men. A large tusk could be twice the length of a man. They worked from dawn until dusk, their bodies aching, their hands raw. The work continued through October 6th, October 10th, October 15th, and October 20th, each day a race against the fading light. On November 1st, a small hunting party returned with a young mammoth. The kill provided fresh meat and renewed their spirits. Kaelin, however, knew that one mammoth would not sustain them through the winter. The bone house had to be completed. By November 12th, they had amassed a staggering collection of bones. They had gathered the bones of at least 95 mammoths, a collection that weighed an estimated 20 tons. Kalin surveyed the scene, a mixture of pride and trepidation in his heart. He had the materials. Now he had to turn them into a home. On November 15th, they began the excavation of the pit. They used their stone adzes and sharpened sticks to chip away at the frozen earth. It was slow, tedious work. The ground was as hard as rock. They worked in shifts, day and night. The pit was to be circular, about 6 meters in diameter and about a meter deep. This semi-subterranean design would use the earth itself as insulation and anchor the structure against the wind. As they dug, they encountered the ghosts of their ancestors. They unearthed old fire pits, discarded tools, the bones of long-dead animals. This discovery on November 20th gave them a renewed sense of purpose. By November 28th, the pit was complete. On November 30th, they started laying the foundation. Kalin directed the placement of the first mammoth skull. It was a massive, heavy thing. It took 6 men to lift it and lower it into place. They positioned it at the northern edge of the pit, the direction from which the winter winds blew the strongest. They spent the next week, from December 1st to December 7th, laying the rest of the foundation. They used 28 skulls in total, arranging them in a tight interlocking circle. They filled the gaps with smaller bones and packed the entire foundation with loess, a fine, silty soil that they dug from pits near the river on December 3rd. The loess, when mixed with water and allowed to freeze, would create a solid, wind-proof seal. Bohr, the skeptical elder, watched the proceedings with a grim, disapproving eye. "You are building a house of death," he said to Kalin on December 8th, his voice a low, ominous rumble. "You are disturbing the spirits of the mammoth." Kalin ignored him. He had no time for doubt, no energy for superstition. His daughter, Ilara, was growing weaker. Her cough was a constant rasping sound that tore at his heart. The House of Bones was her only hope. On December 10th, they began the construction of the walls. This was the most intricate and challenging part of the build. Kalin had devised a system of interlocking the long bones, the femurs and tibias, to create a solid, stable wall. He had them stack the bones in a herringbone pattern, the ends overlapping to create a strong, self-supporting structure. They used the broad, flat scapulae to fill the gaps. It was a slow, painstaking process. Each bone had to be carefully selected and positioned. They used hide ropes to lash the bones together, pulling them tight to create a rigid framework. They filled every crack with a mixture of loess and animal fat, a primitive form of mortar that would freeze solid and make the walls airtight. They were using nearly 900 kilograms of bone for every square meter of the structure. The work was fraught with setbacks. On December 18th, a section of the wall collapsed, the bones tumbling into the pit with a deafening crash. No one was hurt, but the incident sent a wave of fear and doubt through the community. Bohr seized on the opportunity. "It is a sign," he declared on December 19th. "The spirits are angry." For a moment, it seemed as if he had won. The workers stood frozen, but Kalin refused to give in. He climbed down into the pit, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He examined the collapsed section. He saw that they had not properly anchored the base of the wall. It was a mistake, a simple, correctable mistake. He climbed out of the pit and addressed the community on December 20th. "It was not the spirits," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It was my mistake. I did not secure the base. We will rebuild it. We will make it stronger." His words, his confidence, had a powerful effect. The workers, Their fears allayed, returned to their task with renewed determination. They rebuilt the collapsed section, this time anchoring the base with heavy stones. The wall held. By December 29th, the walls were complete. They stood a meter high, a solid, imposing circle of bone. The structure was beginning to take shape, to look like a house. A sense of pride and accomplishment began to replace the fear and doubt. But the most difficult part was yet to come. The roof. Kalen's plan was to use the long, curved tusks to create a domed roof, a structure that would be both strong and aerodynamic. It was a brilliant idea, but it was also incredibly dangerous. The tusks were heavy, unwieldy, and difficult to handle. A single mistake could bring the entire structure crashing down. They began the work on the roof on January 2nd, 18,000 BCE. The winter was now at its peak. The temperatures had plunged to 30 degrees below freezing. The wind was a constant, biting presence. They worked in short, frantic bursts, their bodies numb with cold. They used a team of 6 men to lift each tusk into place. They rested the base of the tusk on the top of the bone wall and angled the tip towards the center of the structure. They used hide ropes to lash the tusks together, creating a framework of interlocking arches. It was a delicate, nerve-wracking process. On January 8th, as they were lifting the final tusk into place, disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind caught the tusk, twisting it in the hands of the workers. The tusk slipped, its base scraping against the top of the wall. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed as if the entire roof was going to collapse. But Kalen, who was directing the placement from the center of the structure, did not panic. He saw that the tusk was not falling, but was simply wedged against the other tusks. He shouted instructions, his voice calm and authoritative. He told them to hold the tusk steady, to not let it slip any further. He then directed another team of workers to use a long pole to lever the tusk back into place. It was a tense, desperate maneuver, but the workers responded to Kalen's commands. They pushed and pulled, their muscles straining, and then, with a final, coordinated effort, they managed to lever the tusk back into place. It settled into its position with a soft, reassuring thud. A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. They had done it. The roof was complete. They spent the next week from January 9th to January 15th, covering the roof with a thick layer of hides. They used the hides of the mammoths they had hunted, stitching them together with bone needles and sinew thread. They stretched the hides over the tusk framework, pulling them tight to create a waterproof, windproof seal. They then covered the hides with a layer of sod and snow, adding to the insulation. On January 16th, the house was finished. It was a strange, almost alien-looking structure, a dome of bone and hide rising from the frozen earth. It was a testament to their ingenuity, their perseverance, their will to survive. It was a house of bones, a fortress against the wind, a beacon of hope in the endless winter. Kalen stood before it, his heart filled with a mixture of pride, relief, and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He had done it. He had built his house of bones. Now, he had to see if it would work. He had to see if it would save his daughter. Part 3. They moved into the bone house on January 17th. The transition was like stepping from one world into another. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, there was a profound, almost unnerving silence. The thick walls of bone, hide, and loess had not just blocked the wind, they had absorbed its voice, rendering it impotent. The warmth was the most striking change. The single hearth, which had been a pitiful source of heat in the drafty hide tent, now filled the circular space with a comfortable, even warmth. The semi-subterranean design trapped the heat, creating a microclimate that was a world away from the brutal cold outside. For the first time in months, they were not just surviving the cold, they were defying it. Ilara, wrapped in a thick layer of furs, was placed in the warmest part of the house, near the fire. Within a few days, the change in her was remarkable. The constant shivering tremor that had racked her small body ceased. The bluish tinge to her lips and fingertips faded. Her cough, though still present, became less frequent, less violent. She slept for long, uninterrupted stretches. On January 24th, she smiled at Kalin, a small, weak smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was a sight that filled him with a fierce, protective joy. His gamble had paid off. The House of Bones was working. The community was in awe. They came to the bone house in small, curious groups, their eyes wide with wonder. They ran their hands over the smooth, cold surfaces of the bones. They marveled at the silence. They basked in the warmth. The House of Bones, which had been a source of so much doubt and skepticism, was now a symbol of hope. Even Bohr, the skeptical elder, was forced to admit that the structure was impressive. He said nothing, but his silence was a grudging admission of defeat. The first few weeks of February were a time of celebration and relief. The winter still raged outside, but inside the bone house they were safe and warm. The community's health improved. The constant sickness that had plagued them in the drafty hide tents began to recede. The children, who had been listless and withdrawn, began to play again, their laughter echoing through the bone-walled chamber. But their sense of security was fragile. As the days turned into weeks, a new insidious problem began to emerge. The very feature that made the house so effective, its airtight seal, was also its greatest flaw. There was no ventilation. The air inside the house grew thick and heavy, saturated with smoke from the hearth, the smell of unwashed bodies, the fumes from the animal fat lamps, and the moisture from their own breath. A thin, greasy film of soot began to coat the bone walls. The air was constantly hazy, and a damp, musty smell clung to their clothes, their hair, their skin. The moisture from their breath condensed on the cold surfaces of the bones, creating a constant, dripping dampness. The House of Bones, which had been a sanctuary, was slowly becoming a swamp. At first they tried to ignore it. They were warm, they were safe from the wind. What was a little smoke, a little dampness, compared to the brutal cold outside? But the problem could not be ignored for long. The stale, damp air was a breeding ground for sickness. On February 10th, Ilara's cough returned, and this time it was worse than before. It was a deep, rattling cough that shook her small frame and left her gasping for breath. Her fever returned, and she grew listless and weak. Soon, other children began to fall ill. They developed coughs, fevers, and a persistent wheezing shortness of breath. The adults were not immune. They complained of headaches, of a constant burning sensation in their eyes and throats, of a deep, bone-weary fatigue. The House of Bones, which had been a symbol of life, was now a place of sickness. The community panicked. The fear and doubt that had been so recently replaced by hope and admiration now returned with a vengeance. Bohr and the other elders seized on the opportunity to reclaim their authority. "It is the curse of the mammoth," Bohr declared on February 15th, his voice ringing with a grim, self-righteous certainty. "The house is built of death, and it breeds death. The air is poisoned by the spirits of the dead. We must abandon this place before it kills us all." His words, spoken in the close, smoky confines of the bone house, had a powerful, terrifying effect. The community, already weakened by sickness and fear, was ready to believe him. They looked at their sick children, they looked at the soot-stained walls, they breathed the thick, foul air, and they saw a tomb. Kalin was devastated. His great innovation, his symbol of hope, had become a trap. He had defeated the wind, only to be defeated by the air itself. He felt a crushing weight of guilt and responsibility. He had led his people into this. He had built this place of sickness. He had failed them. He had failed his daughter. He refused to give up. He could not give up. To abandon the bone house now would be to condemn them all to the slow, freezing death of the hide tents. He had to find a solution. He spent his days and nights in a frantic, desperate search for an answer. He tried creating small openings in the hide roof, but they let in too much cold air, creating drafts that were almost as bad as the wind itself. He tried building a small chimney-like structure over the hearth, but the smoke simply swirled around it and filled the room. He grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, his mind a constant churning turmoil of ideas and calculations. He became obsessed, a man driven to the brink of madness by his own creation. He barely ate, he barely slept. He spent his hours staring at the bone walls, at the smoke-filled air, at the sick, listless faces of his people. On February 22nd, Lyra confronted him. She found him sitting by the hearth, his face buried in his hands. Alara lay nearby, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. Lyra's face was a mask of grief and anger. "She is fading, Kaelin," she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "She is leaving us, and you do nothing but stare at these cursed bones." Kaelin looked up, his eyes full of a desperate, helpless anguish. "I am trying," he said, his voice hoarse. "I am trying to find a way." "Trying is not enough," Lyra said, her voice rising with a fierce, desperate intensity. "The community is turning against you. Boar is talking of leaving, of taking the healthy ones and abandoning the rest of us to our fate. You must do something, Kaelin. You must do it now, or we will all be lost." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He looked at his daughter, her small chest rising and falling with a shallow, fluttering motion. He looked at the faces of his people, their eyes full of a mixture of fear, anger, and a dawning, terrible despair. He looked at the bone walls, the symbol of his genius, the symbol of his failure. He rose to his feet and walked to the entrance of the house. He pulled back the heavy hide flap and stepped outside on February 23rd. The wind was still howling, a wild, untamed beast. The air was so cold it felt like 1,000 tiny needles on his skin. But it was fresh, it was clean, it was alive. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the pure, cold air. And as he stood there, on the threshold between his failed sanctuary and the brutal, unforgiving world outside, he knew that he was at the end of his rope. He had no more ideas, no more solutions. He was defeated. The House of Bones had failed, and with it he had failed his family, his people, and himself. Part 4. As Kaelin stood in the biting wind on February 24th, a profound despair washed over him. He watched the smoke from the hide tents of the few families who had refused to join him in the bone house. Their smoke was whipped away instantly by the wind. His gaze then fell upon a nearby fox den, a small opening in a snowdrift. A faint, almost invisible wisp of vapor, the breath of the sleeping animals, was being drawn out of a second, smaller hole a few feet away, a subtle plume pulled by the wind passing over the drift. He had seen it 1,000 times, the way the wind could both push and pull, a force of pressure and a force of suction. He thought of the way the wind whistled over the top of a hollow reed, drawing the air out of it. He looked back at the bone house, his creation, his failure. The wind, his great enemy, was flowing over the curved roof, a smooth, uninterrupted current of air. He had built a structure that was aerodynamic, a structure that shed the wind. But what if he could use that same aerodynamic principle to his advantage? What if he could use the wind's power not to destroy, but to cleanse? An idea, a final, desperate gamble, sparked in his mind. The wind flowing over the curved roof was creating a low-pressure zone at the apex of the dome. If he could create an opening there, a chimney, the wind would not blow in. It would draw the air out. It would become a giant wind-powered lung, pulling the stale, smoky air from the house and expelling it into the sky. A second, smaller opening near the floor would allow fresh, clean air to be drawn in, creating a constant, self-sustaining circulation. He rushed back into the house on February 25th, his eyes wild with a renewed, frantic energy. He grabbed a piece of charcoal and began to sketch on a flat piece of scapula. He drew a diagram of the house, of the airflow, of the chimney. He would use a section of a hollowed-out mammoth femur, a natural, pre-made tube. He would position it at the very top of the dome, at the point of lowest pressure. He would create a small, adjustable flap at the base of the house to control the intake of fresh air. He gathered the community, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction. He explained his plan, his sketches, his theory of the wind. He spoke of the fox den, of the hollow reed, of the power of the wind to both push and pull. He spoke of a house that could breathe. Bohr laughed on February 26th, a harsh, contemptuous sound. "More madness," he sneered. "You will cut a hole in the roof and let the winter in. You will freeze us all to death. I will not stand by and watch you destroy what is left of this community. We are leaving. Now. Anyone who has the sense to save their own life will come with me." He turned to the crowd, his eyes blazing with a fanatical certainty. "The spirits have spoken. This place is cursed. We must leave it to the ghosts of the mammoths." A wave of fear and indecision swept through the community. They looked at Kalen, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a desperate, almost insane intensity. They looked at Bohr, his face a mask of righteous certainty. They looked at their sick children, their own weary, ailing bodies. But then Lyra stepped forward on February 27th. She had seen the spark in Kalen's eyes. She had heard the logic in his words. It was a desperate gamble, but it was a gamble based on observation, on reason, not on superstition. She placed her hand on Kalen's arm. "I will stay," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will help him." Her words, her simple act of faith, broke the spell. A few others, those who had been closest to Kalen, stepped forward to join her. It was a small group, no more than a dozen, but it was enough. The rest of the community, swayed by Bohr's fear-mongering, began to gather their meager belongings. As Bohr and his followers prepared to leave, Kalen and his small band of loyalists began their work on February 28th. It was a race against time. They worked with a feverish intensity. They climbed onto the roof, the wind tearing at them, the cold, a physical, numbing pain. They used their stone axes to carefully cut a hole in the hide covering. They then used a heavy stone to break through the layer of frozen sod. They finally broke through. A small circular opening in the roof, a window to the gray, unforgiving sky. They then took the hollowed-out mammoth femur, a long, smooth tube of bone, and carefully inserted it into the opening. They packed the gaps around it with loess and animal fat, creating a tight, secure seal. They fashioned a small flap of hide at the base of the house, a simple, adjustable vent to control the intake of fresh air. It was done. The chimney was in place. They scrambled down from the roof, their bodies aching, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. They gathered in the center of the house, their eyes fixed on the opening in the roof. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Bohr, who had paused at the entrance to watch, laughed, a triumphant, mocking sound. "You have failed, Kaelin," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "You have destroyed your own creation. Now you will all freeze in this tomb of your own making." But then a small, almost imperceptible wisp of smoke from the hearth detached itself from the thick, swirling cloud and drifted upwards towards the chimney. It was followed by another and then another. A slow, gentle current of air began to form, a current that was pulling the smoke, the soot, the sickness up and out of the house. A collective gasp went through the small group of loyalists. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous hope. Kaelin rushed to the small vent at the base of the house. He could feel a faint, gentle draft of cold, fresh air being drawn in. It was working. The house was breathing. The change was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but as the minutes turned into an hour, the air inside the house began to clear. The thick, hazy smoke began to thin. The oppressive, suffocating weight of the air began to lift. The soot-stained walls seemed to recede, the space feeling larger, cleaner, brighter. Kaelin rushed to Ilara's side. She was still pale, still weak, but her breathing seemed to have eased. The shallow, ragged gasps had been replaced by a deeper, more regular rhythm. He placed his hand on her forehead. The fever, which had been raging for days, seemed to have broken. She was cool to the touch. He knelt beside her, his heart filled with a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. He had done it. He had saved her. He had saved them all. Bor and his followers stood at the entrance, their faces a mixture of disbelief and astonishment. They could see the change. They could feel it. The air that was now flowing out of the house was no longer the foul, toxic soup of before, but a clean, fresh current. They had been wrong. Kaelin had been right. One by one, they began to drift back into the house, their defiance replaced by a shamefaced humility. Bor was the last to enter. He stood before Kaelin, his face a mask of defeat. He said nothing, but his silence was a complete and utter surrender. His authority was broken, his superstition shattered. The house of bones, the house that breathed, had triumphed. In the days that followed, the health of the community was transformed. The coughs, the fevers, the sickness that had plagued them all began to recede. The house of bones, once a place of sickness, was now a place of healing, a true sanctuary. Kaelin's innovation, born of desperation and perfected through failure, had not just saved them from the wind, it had saved them from themselves. It had taught them a new way to live, a new way to survive. It had changed everything. Part 5. The winter of 18,000 BCE eventually loosened its grip. The days grew longer, the sun warmer. The ice on the Dnieper River began to break up on March 15th, its surface a mosaic of shifting, grinding plates. The herds of reindeer and horse returned on March 22nd, their numbers a sign of the returning life. The mammoths, the great shaggy beasts that had been both their sustenance and their salvation, once again roamed the river valley on April 3rd. The community emerged from the bone house on April 10th, blinking in the bright spring sunlight. They were thinner, their faces etched with the memory of the long, hard winter, but they were alive. They had survived. The house of bones, their fortress against the wind, their sanctuary from the cold, had been their salvation. Kaelin's innovation was not just a temporary solution to a temporary problem. It was a paradigm shift, a fundamental change in their relationship with their environment. The bone house was not just a shelter, it was a machine, a living, breathing entity that harnessed the power of the wind to create a safe, healthy living space. It was a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of the human spirit. The story of the House of Bones, of Kalen's desperate gamble and his ultimate triumph, became a legend, a story told and retold around the fires of 100 generations. The techniques he had developed, the principles he had discovered, were passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter. The bone house at Mezhirish, the first of its kind, became a model, a template for a new way of life. Over the next few thousand years, the practice of building mammoth bone houses spread across the vast, windswept plains of Eastern Europe. From Mezin and Gontsy in Ukraine to Kostenki in Russia, archaeologists would one day unearth the remains of these remarkable structures, each one a variation on Kalen's original design, each one a testament to the enduring power of his idea. In the summer of 17995 BCE, 5 years after the winter of the Great Cold, a trading party from a distant community arrived at Mezhirich on June 8th. They had heard the stories of the House of Bones, and they had come to see it for themselves. They were a people who lived in the open on the high, windswept steppes, and they suffered greatly from the wind and the cold. They listened as Kalen explained his design, his principles of aerodynamics, of ventilation, of insulation. They stayed for a month, learning his techniques, studying his methods. When they left on July 12th, they took with them not just the knowledge of how to build a house of bones, but a new sense of hope, a new vision of what was possible. In 7800 BCE, 2 centuries after Kalen's innovation, the climate began to warm. The great ice sheets that had covered much of Europe began to retreat. The mammoths, the great beasts of the Ice Age, began to decline, their numbers dwindling as their habitat disappeared. The era of the mammoth bone house was coming to an end, but the principles of Kalen's design, the understanding of how to build a warm, dry, well-ventilated shelter, did not die with the mammoths. The knowledge was adapted, modified, applied to new materials, new environments. The semi-subterranean design, the use of natural insulation, the principle of ventilation, all of these became fundamental elements of vernacular architecture across the Northern Hemisphere, from the sod houses of the Vikings to the pit houses of the American Southwest. In the year 1965 CE, nearly 20,000 years after Kalen had built his House of Bones, a farmer in the village of Mezhiric, Ukraine, was expanding his cellar on a warm summer day in July. He dug into the rich black earth, and his shovel struck something hard. He dug further, and he unearthed a massive, fossilized bone. It was the lower jawbone of a mammoth. The discovery led to a full-scale archaeological excavation. A team of scientists, led by the Ukrainian archaeologist Ivan Pidoplichko, spent the next 2 decades carefully unearthing the remains of Kalen's settlement. They found the 4 bone houses, the hearths, the storage pits, the tools, the artifacts, the bones of the mammoths. They marveled at the ingenuity of the construction, the sheer scale of the undertaking. They analyzed the bones, they studied the layout of the settlement, they reconstructed the houses. They used modern, 21st century science to understand the genius of a man who had lived and died 20,000 years before. They discovered the chimney, the hollowed-out mammoth femur that had been the key to the house's success. They understood the principle of ventilation, the way the house had been designed to breathe. They saw the evidence of the sickness, the soot-stained walls, and they understood the crisis that had almost destroyed the community. Kalen's story, once a legend whispered around a fire, was now a matter of scientific record. His House of Bones, once a beacon of hope in a frozen world, was now a museum piece, a testament to the enduring power of human innovation. And as the archaeologists stood in the reconstructed bone house, in the quiet, still air of the museum, they could almost hear the echo of the wind, the wind that had been both the enemy and the inspiration, the force that had driven a desperate hunter-gatherer to build a house of bones, and in doing so, to change the course of human history. The legacy of Caelan, the builder, the innovator, the savior of his people, was not just in the bones he had left behind, but in the enduring, timeless story of human ingenuity in the face of adversity.